Hey everyone, welcome back to our ongoing explainer series on the Factories Act of 1948. Go ahead and grab those clipboards, kawaii or otherwise, you know I love them, because we are jumping straight into our factory tour today. We're covering the absolutely vital welfare measures found in Chapter 3, Health. So here's our syllabus for today's factory inspection. We're hitting 6 main focus areas: the health overview, cleanliness timelines, waste disposal, dust and fumes, artificial humidification, and preventing overcrowding. Let's get to it. All right, starting right off with Section 1, Health under Chapter 3. The absolute foundational concept here is that Chapter 3 places the legal burden of workers' health squarely on the shoulders of the occupier of the factory. As we walk through our fictional factory doors together, just keep in mind that this occupier has to manage 10 very specific health aspects. We're talking everything from overall workroom cleanliness and ventilation, all the way down to providing adequate latrines, urinals, and, yep, even spittoons. Today, we're going to audit 6 of the most heavily tested areas. Moving on to Section 2, Timelines for Factory Cleanliness. Okay, let's look down at the floors and up at the walls. Section 11 of the Act mandates these strict, recurring cleaning schedules. And honestly, the sheer precision of the law here is exactly the kind of detail examiners love to test. Here's the breakdown. Floors of every workroom, they got to be washed weekly with disinfectant. If you've got washable painted surfaces, those need cleaning every 6 months. Then there's the 14-month rule. This applies to whitewashing or cleaning smooth surfaces. And finally, every 5 years, all framework has to be repainted or revarnished. Make sure you get these timelines completely locked in your head. But wait, it's not just about the big long-term schedules. Don't forget the daily grind. Accumulated dirt and refuse, that must be removed from floors, benches, staircases, and passages every single day. You also need effective drainage for removing water. Oh, and here is a massive compliance point. Every single cleaning date we just talked about has to be meticulously logged in a prescribed register. Basically, if it's not in the register to an inspector, it literally didn't happen. Next up, Section 3, Waste and Effluent Disposal. Moving along to the factory's discharge area, Section 12 requires effective arrangements to treat wastes and effluents to render them completely innocuous. Here's a pro tip for your exam. The term waste isn't just the solid garbage you throw in a dumpster. It includes residue like toxic smoke, dust, gases, and slag. Actually, it even includes what the law calls invisible waste, stuff that physically disappears because of shrinkage or evaporation, leaving behind obnoxious gases. The whole shebang falls under this strict rule. All right, Section 4, Managing Dust and Fumes. Watch your lungs as we enter the main manufacturing floor here. Section 14 strictly governs any injurious dust or fumes. This is where you see the really practical side of the law. If you get a scenario question, say about a woodworking shop or a chemical mixing station, remember this exact statutory wording. Exhaust appliance shall be applied as near as possible to the point of origin. The exhaust literally needs to be right next to the saw blade or the chemical vat to actively stop inhalation before it starts. While we're on the subject of air quality, let's take a quick look at Section 13, which kind of pairs standard ventilation against excessively high temperatures. Standard ventilation just requires circulating fresh air to ensure reasonable conditions of comfort. Pretty straightforward, right? But if a process creates excessively high temperatures, think foundries or glass blowing, the law specifically demands separating and insulating those hot parts from the main workroom to protect the workers. It's about active, physical separation, not just propping open a window. Okay, Section 5, Artificial Humidification Standards. In industries like cotton spinning or textile manufacturing, moisture is frequently added to the air, which brings us to Section 15. A massive exam trigger here is the regulatory authority. Notice how across the board it's the state government. The state government, not the central government, prescribes the standards, regulates the methods to increase humidity, directs the testing, and prescribes the ventilation. Seriously, do not let a tricky multiple choice question fool you on this one. And finally, Section 6, Preventing Factory Overcrowding. As we wrap up our floor inspection, let's look at how tightly packed the workers are. I want you to ask yourself this classic, must-know exam question right now. To prevent overcrowding that's injurious to health, precisely how much volumetric space is legally mandated for every single worker in a factory workroom? Burn this number into your memory, 14.2 cubic meters. Let me say it again, 14.2 cubic meters of space per worker. That is the exact metric required by the Factories Act. When you see this pop up on the test, you're going to know exactly what to bubble in. So what does this all mean when we put it together? To absolutely ace your exam, remember that Chapter 3 isn't just about vague, feel-good health concepts. It's an incredibly specific framework. It relies on the occupiers strictly adhering to precise timelines, like that 14-month whitewashing rule, exact metrics, like the 14.2 cubic meters of space, and strict state government testing rules for things like artificial humidification. All right, put on your hard hat because today we are making you the factory inspector. We're running through a virtual audit for your upcoming exam to really lock down the core welfare measures and safety mandates of the Factories Act. So here's our audit agenda. We're hitting lighting and vision safety, then drinking water thresholds, from there latrines, urinals, and spittoons, followed by factory safety mandates, managing hazardous processes, and lastly, a final exam review. Okay, Section 1, Lighting and Vision Safety, which falls under Section 17 of the Factories Act. To kick off our audit, we really need to anchor the first half of this explainer strictly in the realm of welfare measures. Section 17 is our starting point, and it mandates sufficient and suitable lighting, whether that's natural, artificial, or a mix of both. Think about it. Imagine a worker operating a high-speed, incredibly sharp saw. If a sudden glare bouncing off a polished steel surface blinds them for literally a fraction of a second, well, the results could be an absolute disaster. That is exactly what Section 17 is built to prevent. It dictates that all glazed windows and skylights used for lighting absolutely have to be kept meticulously clean on both the inside and out, and totally free from any obstruction. But the really crucial takeaway here is that the factory must proactively prevent direct glare, or even the formation of shadows if it's going to cause eye strain or up the risk of an accident. Moving right along to Section 2, Drinking Water Thresholds, governed by Section 18 of the Factories Act. Let's walk over to the hydration station. We're checking compliance for a sufficient supply of, quote, wholesome drinking water. Now here is a number you need to circle on your exam, 250. The absolute key here is that the moment a factory employs more than 250 workers, the occupier's responsibility gets a major upgrade. They are legally bound to provide cool drinking water during hot weather. It's not just a nice-to-have. It's a specific welfare metric specifically designed to combat heat exhaustion on packed factory floors. And here's another highly testable magic number for you. 6. Water points have to be exactly 6 meters away from any washing place, urinal, latrine, spittoon, open drain carrying effluents, basically any source of contamination. This rule brilliantly highlights the law's zero-tolerance policy on hygiene. You can't just slap a water cooler wherever there's an open outlet. It requires this strict 6-meter buffer zone to completely eliminate the risk of cross-contamination. Next up is Section 3, Latrines, Urinals, and Spittoons, covering Sections 19 and 20 of the Factories Act. Notice the stark contrast in these rules. They scale really aggressively with the size of the workforce. For your standard factory, the basics apply. Separate and closed accommodations for male and female workers, adequate lighting, good ventilation, and employing sweepers to keep things sanitary. But watch what happens when we cross that 250 worker threshold again. It's a huge shift. Suddenly, all latrine and urinal accommodations have to be of prescribed types. The floors and internal walls of the sanitary blocks must be laid in glassed tiles, giving them a smooth, polished, impervious surface. And they literally have to be scrubbed down with detergents or disinfectants at least once every 7 days. No exceptions. Oh, and whatever you do, don't forget Section 20. It's one of those often overlooked but utterly critical welfare rules. It requires a sufficient number of spittoons placed conveniently all over the factory. This is a foundational hygienic mandate meant to stop the spread of disease, and naturally, they have to be maintained in a strictly clean and hygienic condition. All right, step it into Section 4, Factory Safety Mandates, which takes us into Chapter 4 of the Factories Act. We're officially leaving the welfare zone and stepping onto the actual production floor to dig into the heavy-duty Chapter 4 safety protocols. Now, Chapter 4 has a massive list of mandates, so we're going to chunk them into logical buckets to make it easier to digest. First up, machinery safety. This is all about keeping dangerous moving parts fenced off and strictly controlled. We're talking rigorous regulations for workers operating near machinery in motion, the mandatory casing of any brand new machinery, an absolute ban on employing women and children near cotton openers, and incredibly strict safety checks for lifting machines, chains, ropes, lifting tackles, and any fast-revolving machinery. It's a lot, but it's all about physical containment. So how does that translate to the physical environment itself? That brings us to our second bucket, building and access safety. As an inspector, you have to ensure that floors, stairs, and all means of access are structurally rock solid and totally clear of obstacles so nobody takes a deadly fall. It also means securely covering up any dangerous pits or sump openings in the floor. At the end of the day, the overall safety and maintenance of the factory buildings themselves have to be absolutely guaranteed. Our third safety bucket is a big one: hazard mitigation and personnel protection. Just look at the sheer breadth of these protections. They range from mitigating explosive dust and gas risks to legally capping the excessive weights workers are allowed to lift. It mandates highly specific eye protection for dangerous processes, intense precautions against fires and dangerous fumes, rules for using portable electric lights, and for certain larger-scale operations, it even mandates the appointment of dedicated safety officers. Let's move to Section 5, Managing Hazardous Processes, under Chapter IVA of the Factories Act. We are finally entering the most critical area of our entire audit trail, the restricted zone covering Chapter IVA on hazardous processes. Okay, the absolute crucial point to grasp here is the role of the Site Appraisal Committee. When a factory deals with hazardous materials, the state steps right in. This committee, appointed directly by the state government, acts as the ultimate gatekeeper. Their entire job is to thoroughly examine applications for either setting up a new hazardous factory or expanding an existing one. And trust me, they have teeth. They have the absolute power to call for literally any piece of information they want from the applicant. So how does an occupier actually navigate this gauntlet? It follows a very clear administrative flow. Step 1. The occupier formally applies for the location or expansion. Step 2. The state government appoints that site appraisal committee we just talked about to advise them. Step 3, the committee rips into the application, gathering all the necessary safety and environmental data, using their power to request whatever extra info they need. And finally, Step 4, the committee hands its formal recommendation over to the state government. Pro exam tip here, guys. Burn this number into your memory: 90. The Site Appraisal Committee has exactly 90 days from the receipt of the application to hand its recommendation to the state government. The clock is ticking the second that application lands, but their review still has to be incredibly thorough. Now, this next point is a classic trick question on exams, so pay attention. Once that application is officially approved by the state government, based on the committee's recommendation, you absolutely do not need redundant approvals from the central or state pollution boards. The state government's approval acts as the ultimate overriding green light. One and done.
So if you're a focused learner trying to really master the legal frameworks governing industrial welfare, you are absolutely in the right place. Today, we're acting as your ultimate study guide to completely conquer Chapter 5 of the Factories Act. We're going to lock this crucial piece of social legislation right into your memory.
Here's exactly what we're covering in this explainer today. First up, the introduction to factory welfare. Second, basic needs and rest. Third, health and first aid. Fourth, canteens and shelters. And finally, specialized needs like creches and welfare officers.
Okay, let's just dive right in. Section 1, Introduction to Factory Welfare, the Chapter V Blueprint.
Now, at its core, the Factories Act is literally built to protect workers from exploitation, right? It's all about guaranteeing better working conditions. And Chapter 5 specifically lays out the non-negotiable welfare measures that every single factory occupier just has to provide. There's an 8-point prescribed checklist here: washing facilities, storing and drying clothing, sitting facilities, first aid appliances, canteens, shelters, creches, and finally, welfare officers. Honestly, treat this list like your foundational exam blueprint. Every question you're going to see about factory welfare is pulling directly from one of these 8 pillars.
Moving on to Section 2, Basic Needs and Rest. These are the universal rules. So, Sections 42 through 44 apply across the board. They're fundamentally about securing basic human dignity on the factory floor, and that's regardless of your total worker headcount. For washing and clothing, the law is super clear. Adequate washing facilities must always be conveniently accessible and, kept squeaky clean. But there's a strict rule here you've got to remember. There must be separate, adequately screened facilities for male and female workers. On top of that, state governments can step in and require factories to provide suitable, secure places for workers to store the clothes they aren't wearing during their shift, plus actual provisions for drying their wet work gear.
And then we get to Section 44, which I think just brilliantly illustrates the human element of this whole law. It demands that suitable arrangements for sitting have to be provided for all workers who are obliged to work in a standing position. Just picture a worker on a fast-paced assembly line who's literally on their feet all day long. Legally, that factory has to provide a nearby chair or some kind of sitting arrangement. That way they can actually take advantage of any tiny opportunities for rest that might pop up during the daily grind.
All right, Section 3, Health and First Aid. This is where the numbers game begins.
Listen, in employment law, exam points are absolutely won and lost on threshold callouts. It really all comes down to memorizing specific worker head counts. So your first crucial number is 150. Under Section 45, for every 150 workers employed at any one time, the factory has to provide at least one readily accessible first aid box or cupboard. And no, you can't just toss an empty box on the wall. It has to contain prescribed contents, and it must be kept in the charge of a separate responsible person. Oh, and that person needs to actually hold a recognized certificate and first aid treatment from the state government, and they have to be readily available during all working hours. No exception.
Now, I want you to immediately contrast that 150 mark with our next number, 500. We're still under Section 45 here, but if a factory crosses that big 500 worker threshold, a simple first aid box just doesn't cut it anymore. At this point, the occupier must provide a fully equipped ambulance of a prescribed size. We're talking complete with nursing staff, the works. And just like the first aid person, this ambulance has to be made readily available at all times.
Which brings us to Section 4, Canteens and Shelters. Let's look at sustenance thresholds.
Okay, let's unpack Sections 46 and 47. These deal with sustenance and rest spaces. Now, these are strictly governed by headcount thresholds too, and honestly, they are so incredibly easy to mix up on a test if you aren't paying close attention. So, a shelter, restroom, or a suitable lunchroom, that's triggered when a factory employs more than 150 workers. And those spaces need drinking water, they have to be sufficiently lighted, ventilated, and kept cool and clean. But a full-blown canteen, that is only triggered when there are more than 250 workers. What's super interesting here is that the items of expenditure for running that canteen, basically the costs that aren't factored into the actual price of the food itself, well, the employer has to bear those costs entirely.
Now here is a massive pro tip for scoring top marks if you get an essay question on Section 46. It comes straight from a 2003 case, Ferro Alloys Corporation Limited versus Government of Andhra Pradesh. The court basically clarified that the factory occupier has total discretion here. They can set up the canteen directly themselves, or they can hire a contractor to do it. But crucially, if they use a contractor, the people working in that canteen are not legally considered employees of the factory establishment itself. It's a really important distinction to make.
Let's move to Section 5, Creches and Welfare Officers. This is all about specialized needs.
These next provisions deal with highly specialized support roles and the family needs of the workforce. I want you to flash this number into your mind right now, 30. But hey, beware of a classic exam trap here. Having 30 total workers does not magically trigger the creche requirement. Nope. Under Section 48, it strictly requires more than 30 women workers to be employed before that mandate for a creche kicks in.
So, when that 30 women threshold is finally met, the occupier has to provide a creche. For your written answers, you really need to remember these 4 specific statutory conditions. 1. It has to be a suitable room for children under the age of 6. 2. It must be adequately ventilated. 3. It's got to be maintained in a clean and sanitary condition. And 4. It absolutely must be under the charge of women who are specifically trained in the care of children and infants.
All right, we're bringing back this huge threshold number for Section 49. Yep, 500 workers. We already know that 500 triggers the ambulance requirement, right? Well, it also triggers the requirement to appoint prescribed welfare officers. If a factory employs 500 or more workers, the occupier absolutely must bring on these specialized officers. It's a non-negotiable.
And once again, to brilliantly illustrate the strict legal boundaries of this specific role, we can look at a 1993 Supreme Court case, Shyam Vinyls Limited versus T. Prasad. In this case, the court basically held that an assistant personnel officer couldn't just magically be considered a labor welfare officer by default, even if he did happen to be looking after the problems and welfare of the laborers. You see, the role of a welfare officer is a very distinct, prescribed legal appointment. You can't just treat it as a casual add-on to someone's existing HR job.
Okay, let's wrap all this up with the ultimate cheat sheet matrix. Honestly, lock these thresholds into your brain before exam day. 150 workers, that's for first aid boxes and shelters. 250 workers, that gets you canteens. 30 women workers, that's the trigger for a creche. And the big 500 workers, that triggers both the ambulance and the welfare officers.
Seriously, if you can just quickly sketch out these relationships on a piece of scratch paper when you sit down for the test, you've practically mastered Chapter 5.